Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, here we are for Science with Sergio, episode number 3. And we've got a doozy today. We've got Towards the Unity of Pathological and Exertional Fatigue, a predictive coding model, which may at first sound like a bunch of gibberish, but we're here today to try to break it down and turn it into something that's useful and helpful for people who are coaching or athletes who like to have the inside scoop of the details of what might be going on with their bodies when they're trying to exercise quickly. So in terms of a framework for what we're actually talking about today, the goal is to understand the way that the brain models fatigue and to understand what fatigue may actually be from a physiological perspective. And I think for athletes and for coaches that having at least some basic understanding of the models that brain researchers are using to understand how the brain actually processes information is potentially useful for designing training, for communicating with athletes, and then also, sort of a pet peeve of mine personally. I think there's a lot of really bad mindset content out there in the fitness space that can mischaracterize a lot of the research about the brain's role in performance. And if we actually understand what's going on from the perspective of modeling the way that the brain processes information, we can maybe have a better filter for thinking about the role of mindset and training and understand how important it is, which is extremely important, but also simultaneously understand what it can't do, which is just this kind of like magical thinking. If you want it more, you'll be able to get it. If you just visualize your results, you're going to set a snatch PR by 25 pounds, like all that stuff that's, quite frankly, bullshit. So with this paper, we have folks kind of going through a bunch of different models of predictive coding is the language they use, which is the model that a lot of brain researchers use to think about the way that we sort of interact with the world. And they're trying to apply it to fatigue models in performance and then also in chronic fatigue simultaneously. So the way that the brain thinks about taking in sensory information and moving us through the world so that we can get food and mate and not run into walls and all that kind of stuff is the same type of information processing that it utilizes to help us do thrusters and pull-ups as quickly as we can without falling apart. So to start with, I think that it might be useful to actually go through this predictive processing model that is kind of the keystone for this paper as a whole. So before we actually do that, Sergio, I know that I actually picked the paper this time and I kind of thrust it upon you and I was like, we're going to talk about predictive processing. And you're like, okay, man, like sounds good. Before I potentially explain this predictive processing model of cognition, is there anything that jumps out to you to start with that we should really make sure to discuss?
Well, yeah. So like you said, this paper is really dense and I think this topic is super important when it comes to thinking about fatigue, because typically when we think about fatigue, particularly in like a conditioning setting or like a sport specific setting, we generally are thinking about what's happening physiologically and like physically to the body. And as coaches, when we create these like training templates or these plans to help people kind of like manage that, it's usually like, okay, like let's build like a better aerobic base or improve your ability to produce relatively high power outputs for short periods of time, et cetera, to better metabolize this or get stronger like this. And then when it comes to kind of like thinking about how to manage the experience of what's actually happening inside the body and kind of like the emotional response or like the sensation of that, I think it's generally like, okay, like visualize it and, kind of like hope and get better at hope that you'll be able to get better at dealing with this pain, or just kind of like learn to go hard and like go hard very often. You'll get better at that. And I don't particularly think that that's like necessarily very, very insightful or something that can apply to a lot of people. So I think getting a better understanding of this predictive processing model and like what is actually happening to the body relative to what the brain is expecting to happen and kind of how to improve that relationship, I think is going to be really important for people when it comes to improving their relationship with their performance in the sports and what their body is actually experiencing in those sport specific scenarios.
Yeah, totally. I think what you said there is very insightful, and that people will often think of their performance as like, okay, here's the mental aspect of performance. I'm going to have a gratitude journal. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to visualize, and I'm going to come up with affirmations and like read dumb pop psychology books, right? And then they're like, and then there's the physical aspect of my performance where I build my aerobic system, improve my ability to utilize lactate, as we've discussed previously, and that these are kind of viewed almost as separate things. And even within the performance, performance coaches arguing with each other and talking about things, it does seem to be that people tend to fall into one camp or the other, which is like, oh, we need to improve your mindset. And then everything falls out from there. Or people are like, oh, all this mindset stuff is a bunch of hooey. And it's all just about, contractile potential and how well you can metabolize lactate. And that obviously, people arguing with each other online is not the highest resolution way to come to some sort of conclusion on complicated issues. But this does remind me similarly of like nature versus nurture debates when discussing, outcomes in populations or whatever, right? And it's like, well, it's obviously both, right? That these interact with each other, that people have genetic potential, and then their genetic potential is realized based upon what they do, and certain actions can actually change the way that different genes are expressed. And it's just this like complicated back and forth bidirectional causality. And it's irrelevant to discuss whether something is nature or nurture, when the reality is so messy and complicated. And I think that we're seeing something similar with this false dichotomy between the mental aspect of performance and the physical aspect of performance, I suppose.
For sure. And I think this is going to start to make a bit more sense once you like actually start to break this down and explain this. But I think generally when we think about fatigue, it is usually this like, okay, we need to get the brain better at responding to this. So we need to attack this from a purely physiological level of like, we need to improve your physiology, and then your brain in turn is just going to like, that's going to improve your experience in a workout, rather than improving your body's ability to perceive and adapt relative to the stimulus, in that like period of acute exertion. So I think if you can kind of like learn to look at it from both perspectives and figure out or create this sort of model for your athletes where they can start to improve their relationship with understanding what's actually happening in the brain relative to what's actually happening in the body, then I think you'll see a lot of improvements in the performance overall.
Yeah, totally. And after we kind of go through the details of this paper, we will try to give some more actionable things related directly to coaching people or performing in the gym and all that stuff. So I think that maybe it's time that we take a stab at actually explaining the predictive coding model that this entire paper is based upon. So I'll give that a shot. And then Sergio, feel free to jump in and interrupt me and ask questions if I say something that doesn't make sense or if I use too much jargon or whatever. Because again, I think this is really, really important stuff. And this can give a ton of insight, not just into athletic performance, but a lot of stuff about cognition and human behavior and all that. So we're going to go for it. How's that sound?
For sure. Sounds good.
Let's do it. So a lot of the citations in this paper in particular are based upon Carl Friston's work. And Friston has done a bunch of lectures on YouTube. He's been on a bunch of podcasts, published a bunch of papers explaining some of these models. So if this is interesting to you, I would encourage you to go search out more of Friston's stuff. It can be difficult, right? He doesn't always speak in the clearest way. And I know that some of the stuff he says can seem a little bit circuitous, but I think that once you start to understand the basics of what's going on, that it can kind of fall into place, and it can become much easier to follow. So I'll attempt to lay that out in a way that's hopefully useful, and then we'll build off of that to discuss fatigue. So the basic idea of this predictive processing model is based upon a lot of stuff from information theory and based upon a lot of stuff from Bayesian statistics, right? So without going down the rabbit hole in those areas, and I will say that information theory, not super comfortable with, I have a very surface level knowledge of that stuff. Bayesian statistics may be a little bit more comfortable with that stuff. So I'll try to avoid getting too deep into the actual math of what's going on there. But from the perspective of a biological organism or a brain, what have you, it's essentially trying to do a lot of predictions all the time, and it's attempting to try to make its predictions match the outside world, right? So again, if we sort of think about just a theoretical organism, it has some sort of internal state where it's thinking about what's going on in the world, and it's making predictions about what's happening in the world, and it's taking in sensory information about the world outside of itself, and it's trying to make its predictions align with what's actually happening, right? So if we use an actual example, we can think about some sort of cell inside of some water or whatever, and it's like, okay, I am predicting that there will be food in this area, and as such, I'm going to move myself to that area, and I'm going to attempt to make my internal prediction of food in this area that I'm going to eat align with the outside world by moving into that area and seeing if there's food, right? And this predictive model can result in behaviors happening, and it can also result in updating its previous idea of what's actually happening in the world, right? So if the cell moves to that area that it predicted it would find food and it doesn't find it, then it can then go back and update its previous model of food tends to be over here and say, okay, you know what, the likelihood of food being here is a little bit lower than I previously predicted, right? So essentially what's going on is there's this internal state of prediction, there's an external state of reality, and then there's sensory information that's passing from the external state into the internal state. And the goal of the organism is to make the external state and the internal state match as much as possible by both improving its internal models of what's going on, right? So updating its actual predictions of what's happening, as well as doing behaviors in the external world that make the external world align with its internal predictions, right? And that second one is a little bit tricky to verbalize in a way that I think makes sense and is intuitive. But that, I think those are the basics of this predictive processing model. And so, Sergio, I have no idea if I explained that in a way that makes sense. I probably should have thought about my analogies a little bit ahead of time. But what do you think about that? Is that clear at all? Or is that confusing? What do you think?
Yeah, okay. So from what I understand, our brains are constantly making these hypotheses about like what's actually happening outside of the body. So in the external environment and what's happening internally. And so the goal there is to minimize the discrepancy between what our brain was expecting to experience and what's actually experienced. And what's actually being experienced. And the two ways we can do that are by updating the model of what we perceive or updating what's actually happening around us, right? So can I try to give an analogy on how I think I understand that?
Yeah, totally.
So say something like, I guess like pain, or say when you're a kid, you go and you touch the stove and it's on, right? Like as you're approaching the stove, you don't really know that it's on or that it's hot. You just know that it's a thing, right? So you go to the stove, we have these nociceptors or pain receptors, right, that like let us know that something is uncomfortable or that something hurts. The first time you touch it, it burns. You have no relationship or no expectation of pain when you touch this thing that's really hot, right? And then you burn yourself, it hurts, your body doesn't like it. After that, you now have this relative expectation that when you get close to the stove, whether it's on or off, it's going to hurt, right? If you approach it with your hand. So every time you start to approach it with your hand, internally, your body has created this model or this hypothesis that you're going to experience pain. In an effort to better prepare yourself to handle or manage that experience, and kind of like close the gap between the prediction of what's going to happen and what's actually happening, right? So when you go and actually touch the stove, it might not be on, but for like a split second, when you put your hand on the stove, you feel like you might experience that pain. You're like, you kind of squint, right? And that was a prediction error, and your body then like might be able to update the model of what's actually happening there. And so if like the model is like this causes me pain, you'll avoid that. So you're kind of like, I don't know if that would be an approach of changing your perspective or the kind of like the external environment there. But you're basically trying to close the gap between what's actually happening outside and what your brain hypothesized was going to happen. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a good example as far as revising priors, basically, right? To use more Bayesian terms. So the idea is that if you don't have a model that stoves can potentially burn you, and then you touch a stove and it burns you, then you can update your model of how stoves work to be like, okay, when this thing is in my presence, I need to be aware that it might burn me. And sort of like you mentioned, maybe you make that update and you're like, stoves burn people. This is my model for the world. But then you potentially learn, oh, it has to be on in order to burn me. So your model can become higher resolution as you take in more information about what actually happens relative to that prediction. So when you make a prediction error, the prior gets updated and gives you a better model of how to move forward in the future, I think is the idea as far as how you're saying that.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then the other thing, which I think is a little bit difficult, maybe we can use an example of drinking water, right? You can also have a prediction, and then you can make the external world match that prediction. And that's another way to minimize the difference between the predicted scenario and what's actually happening, right? So in order to drink water, the way that this predictive coding model would phrase what's happening is that you're predicting that you're going to pick up a glass and put it in your mouth, and you're going to get sensory information of wetness. And you can minimize the discrepancy between the prediction and the actual reality by picking up a glass of water and drinking it, right? Because your prediction is glass in hand, wetness in mouth, etc., and you just make that happen, and then that predictive discrepancy is now minimized. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the third way that you can also adjust prediction errors, which is kind of the thrust of this paper, is by actually moving into a state where the amount of prediction error is going to be inherently lower, right? So if you're doing something and you're getting a lot of prediction errors, that's in some way negatively valenced, right? That's something that your brain doesn't like a whole lot. It's like, okay, we're predicting that this is what's supposed to be happening, and what we're predicting is not happening at all. So we need to move this organism into a state where we're not getting as many errors in prediction kind of propagating throughout the system. And the idea here, to get specifically into exercise-based fatigue, is that as you get into a more and more fatigued state, your brain's ability to predict what's going to happen on a physiological level starts to get diminished to the point that you get very significant prediction errors. And we can use some specific examples of like blood pH, carbon dioxide levels in the blood, contractile ability of certain muscles. Like all of these things start to be wrong as far as predictions. And then based upon those predictions being incorrect, the brain decides that it needs to move into a more predictable state as an organism. And that more predictable state is not exercising at high intensity, right? It's like, okay, shit is going wrong. We're making a bunch of errors as far as how we think things should be going, as far as allocating resources throughout the body, energy storage, muscle contraction. Like we're really screwing up here. So we need to go back home. We need to go somewhere safe. And that's going to be sitting on the ground, eating, or like drinking Gatorade, as opposed to like flailing on the assault bike. Right. And that's kind of the main thrust of this paper. So what questions do you have on that? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. So would you be able to kind of explain, so my perspective on this prediction, like an error in prediction. And so we're assuming that errors in prediction are not necessarily a good thing, right? So if your body hypothesizes that this is what's going to happen, and more of what's actually happening is farther away from that prediction, there's more error associated with that prediction. And so the way I see that as being bad is that we have these allostatic mechanisms so with allostasis, right? Homeostasis, it's the maintenance of a constant internal environment. It's that kind of like, I don't want to say equilibrium, but this kind of like normal resting optimal state that we are typically in, right? And so allostasis is essentially the self-regulation or like physiological processes of getting yourself back into homeostasis, right? So when you come out of homeostasis, allostasis is the process of, or the accumulation of these different physiological processes that get you back into homeostasis, right? So the smaller your margin of prediction error actually is, the more prepared allostatically you are to return to homeostasis, right? So if you have a lot of prediction error, your ability to kind of self-regulate or prepare is going to decrease, which essentially is happening in like those high intensity settings where we are beginning to experience that fatigue, where we want to come back to a like we're always trying to get back to as close to homeostasis as possible, right? So the less we are prepared allostatically to do that, right, the more we're going to be inclined to change our actions to hopefully manipulate our external environment to make it easier to then allow our allostatic processes to bring us back down to homeostasis. Does that kind of make sense? And is that a good way to think about prediction error?
Yeah, totally. And I think that the idea of returning to homeostasis is really important here. I do want to add something which might make this more confusing and more complex, unfortunately. But I think the way that you're phrasing that is pretty valuable and insightful, right? And I think we've used the analogy of a thermostat before to discuss some of these processes, which isn't always appropriate for the body, but it will have to do in this case, right? And so the idea is that your brain, if it has some sort of thermostat that it's controlling, let's say, okay, cool, we want it to be roughly 70 degrees inside. It's taking in sensory information. It's like, yo, it's 14 degrees out. We need to prepare the furnace to turn on because pretty soon this is going to be dropping, right? As opposed to say in the summer where it's 85 degrees out and it's like, yo, it's pretty hot outside. We need to prepare the air conditioning to turn on, right? So the brain is predictively preparing these allostatic mechanisms to return whatever system is perturbed to its kind of baseline state that it wants to be in. And so through improved predictive coding, right? Through accurate predictive coding, you can properly prepare all these allostatic mechanisms to do their job. And that's the situation that a lot of elite athletes are in, is that they are able to appropriately prepare their allostatic mechanisms and predict appropriately what needs to be done and like what kind of problems are going to pop up. It's like, yeah, you know what? Like our blood pH is going to change a little bit and that's going to be okay. We're going to have some difficulty contracting the rotator cuff muscles and that's going to be okay. That these problems that pop up are not significantly outside of the predicted model for what's going to happen. And as such, the allostatic mechanisms are prepared to deal with them. And also we don't get these significant errors in prediction propagating back up through the chain, right? So that's a little tricky because it's almost like there's two layers of what's going on. It's sort of like the second derivative in calculus, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you have the allostatic mechanism, and then you have the prediction of how the allostatic mechanism is going to be used and is going to function. And from this predictive coding model, the problems happen when the predictions of how the allostatic mechanisms are going to be utilized and what type of perturbation they're going to need to deal with are incorrect. That's when this error starts to propagate throughout the system. Does that make sense?
I think so. And I think, yeah, and that does start to get a little bit confusing because it's like, okay, how much of what I'm actually experiencing in a workout is like my perception of what's going on and relative to what's actually happening in my body.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's the thrust of the paper, right?
So I think something that's interesting to think about is I was reading something about so like you know what a Moxie unit is, right? Like a NIRS device, mm-hmm. like and so
yeah. Can you give a quick breakdown of what's going on with that?
Yeah, so a NIRS device or like a Moxie unit is just kind of like the name they use for that specific NIRS. It's a form of measuring like oxygen saturated hemoglobin or like deoxygenated hemoglobin, or kind of like the ability to look at how much oxygen is actually in, like, let's say a muscle, for example. So it's like if you have somebody doing, and it's not invasive, right? Like you just like slap something on somebody's quad, like hook it up to the Moxie unit and kind of give you, a reading as to what's actually happening in the muscle. And if somebody's on a bike or something, you've got them hooked up to a Moxie unit and you have them doing assault bike sprints. Or let's say you have them doing 3 sets of like 3 minutes at relatively hard effort with 2 minutes of rest in between. In those 3 minutes, you're paying attention to what the athlete is experiencing mentally and what's actually happening in the quadricep, right? So you know that the athlete is able to continue to produce this specific effort on the bike when the oxygen saturation in the muscle is at this level, and there's kind of a baseline where once you've depleted or gone past that point, you can no longer produce this effort, right? So you're looking at when an athlete is no longer able to produce that effort, and if the oxygen saturation or like the physiology of the muscle is not to a point where fatigue is necessarily supposed to happen, but they're experiencing their fatigue in a different way and saying like, oh, I can't do this. Like, I am fatigued. I am finished, right? So you're kind of actually able to see what's actually happening in the body and the perception of that. And I think that could potentially give some insight into how this almost like the inability to self-regulate allostatically or manage the perception of that can force you to fatigue much sooner than you're actually necessarily supposed to fatigue.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really great example to speak specifically about, just blood pooling in a muscle or blood totally desaturating of oxygen in a muscle, because we essentially simultaneously have real physiological limits to performance, which is like you can literally not get blood in and out of your bicep right now. You've utilized all the oxygen. You have nowhere for calcium to bind in that muscle. You cannot contract it anymore. And there are hard physiological limits to performance like that. And simultaneously, you have these predictive processing limits, which recognize that prediction errors are propagating and that things are going wrong, and start to preemptively shut down your ability to actually perform exercise or perform contractions, because it's like, you're say you're following your GPS and you start to end up like in a construction site that isn't, no one posted it on Waze, and you're like, this is wrong. Like, this is not where I'm supposed to be right now. Something is going badly. Like, I'm going the wrong way on a one-way street because they blocked this thing off and they're having traffic flow go the other way. Like, we're somewhere we don't belong. We're going to go ahead and stop and turn around, reverse out of here. Like, we got to figure out what's going on, right? That both of those create the sensation of fatigue, I think, is the idea.
Yeah, I think this is starting to come together a little bit.
Yeah, maybe that I should have thought of that analogy previously. That's potentially that would have been useful to explain before. But actually, that does tie into one of the other models that I want to talk about, which actually isn't discussed in this paper, but I think is at least somewhat relevant or not relevant, but prevalent in the CrossFit field, right? Is Marcora's model of motivation and rate of perceived exertion actually creating fatigue, right? And that the idea there is that you have motivation to perform exercise. And this isn't just like motivation because I read an Instagram post and I'm like feeling stoked to get in the gym, right? It's like your willingness to put forth continued effort in the face of increasing rate of perceived exertion. And then rate of perceived exertion is kind of like a roll-up measure of all of the stuff that we're talking about. It's the physiological fatigue that you're actually accumulating. It's these signals from your brain that something is going wrong, telling you to stop or slow down. And so as your rate of perceived exertion goes up without a simultaneous increase in your motivation to continue performing exercise, your performance starts to drop, right? And so based upon what we're actually talking about now, what I think potentially happens is that through these errors in prediction, which then cause that this desire to minimize the discrepancy between internal prediction and external reality, that starts to spike your rate of perceived exertion, right? That things feel harder, and this mechanism of fatigue spikes your rate of perceived exertion because your brain is telling you that something is wrong and we need to actually slow down. You can override that, right? You can override that through motivation in the technical term, which is like, everything is going wrong, everything is falling apart. If I don't finish this workout 10 seconds faster than I did last time, I don't qualify for the next stage of the CrossFit Games. And I'm able to override that signal to a point. And at some point you hit limits, right? You do hit these limits of like, you literally cannot contract your quadriceps anymore at the force output that's necessary to stand up this clean, right? You actually cannot overcome the amount of acid within your system to be able to maintain this pace on your burpees. That those limits do exist, but that simultaneously your motivation to continue pushing can override them to a point before you start to get overwhelmed by the actual physical limits and these sort of like subconscious predictive error limits, which are just screaming at all of your systems like, shit is falling apart. You absolutely have to stop, or else we're just going to like drive, we're going to accidentally drive into a spot and like get a backhoe, like dumping concrete on us in this construction site we accidentally ended up in.
All right. So so from what I understand, in order to not fatigue, like say you're doing like a 10-minute Metcon, right? And so in order to not fatigue, as your rate of perceived exertion increases, your motivation is your ability to push past the increase in rate of perceived exertion, right? So as RPE increases, motivation relative to that RPE or relative to sustain that RPE has to increase. Otherwise, your performance in the piece is going to decrease.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to understand that a little better.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, to kind of try to make some of this stuff, I don't know, maybe more practical as far as understanding what's going on, it's probably important to discuss the different layers that these issues can occur on, because I think that's something else that, before we were talking about this nested concept of the allostatic mechanisms that the body's using to regulate its various systems, which are then giving feedback to this broader predictive coding model, which is then generating fatigue signals, right? That there's that whole mess. But then there's simultaneously the fact that these types of mechanisms are occurring at every layer of the stack of performance, right? That this is occurring sort of big picture, zoomed out idea of like, okay, I'm an athlete. I wrote down my 10-minute AMRAP on my whiteboard and I have a plan going into it. I know this is going to be uncomfortable. I think I should be able to maintain like roughly a 145 to 148 per 500 meter pace on the row. And if I'm doing burpees and I can keep them in something like a 15 to 18 per minute pace, that should be sustainable for me for this workout, that's my, conscious a prediction of what's going to happen. And then there's the reality of how those paces actually feel, right? That's kind of like a zoomed out level of the stack on which these things are happening. It's simultaneously happening all throughout the body in terms of, heart rate. Okay, how fast does the heart need to actually beat to continue to deliver blood and oxygen to the different muscles that are actually working, and that's happening on a predictive level, that some subconscious mechanism is like, okay, cool, we're doing this rowing burpee thing again. Normally when we do this, we need to keep the heart rate at like 167. Like, let's go ahead and like get into that spot and start to see what happens, right? And then if you're able to actually deliver the necessary blood and oxygen, you're able to kind of clear waste products, that prediction is correct. But then if it's wrong, then, something needs to happen. It's like, the 167 isn't cutting it. Let's go ahead and turn the knob up a little bit. Let's try 172. Let's see how we do, right? So that's happening at a heart rate level. And then sort of like we mentioned before, these predictive processes are happening on a more like cellular level, on a more like just biochemistry level too, where it's like, okay, cool, we need to be able to contract the quadriceps to do this movement. And we know that we're going to start to accumulate some sort of acidity. So not all of our motor units are going to be accessible. So let's go ahead and predict that that's going to happen ahead of time. And like, why don't we recruit a little bit more pectineus to get this movement done? Right? Because we're not going to be able to use as much quadricep. So let's recruit a little bit more pectineus. Let's see what happens. And then based upon how you're actually doing with the ability to generate those contractions, information starts to flow up and down. So every layer of the stack is having this predictive, I don't know what the right word is, prediction of what it needs to do to maintain the pace that you're trying to hold, or to clear the waste products, or to do the movement that you're trying to do. And information is being reported back about how correct that prediction is. And the amount of error between the prediction and what's actually happening is being processed, which then results in further predictions about how to continue doing the exercise, or sort of like we talked about before, that big picture idea of like, yo, we're way off. Like, everything is going wrong. We need to get to a safer spot where we can actually predict what's happening.
Okay, so looking at something like tangible, I have a question about anxiety pre-workout, right? So the way I look at kind of a workout setting is that I don't necessarily see it as performing well, but everything that's happening in the body is primarily about like survival, right? So like our instinct is to kind of like survive. So and that ties back to homeostasis. Homeostasis is comfort. Comfort is survival, right? So pre-workout, you start to get a little bit anxious because you know that you have this expectation as to what this piece is going to feel like. Do you feel like something like with anxiety, there's this correlated increase in heart rate, potentially the preparation to, like we see something like vasodilation, where like with anxiety, where it's like you have an increase in blood flow, or preparing to have a correlated increase in blood flow with this expected perceived output that's about to happen. Do you think that kind of anxiety, which is most likely stemming from the perception of what you're about to experience being far from homeostasis, is a mechanism in which it's going to better prepare you to handle that in like 30 seconds or a minute when you're actually about to start the piece? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, but any sort of performance anxiety is absolutely that type of predictive coding of like, okay, we're about to do this stressful thing. We need to prepare the system in order to, do rowing and burpees, or to step on stage and give a presentation in front of, hundreds of people, or to take an important test, right? Like all of this stuff, is there's a prediction that you're going to need a heightened state of arousal in order to do it. Then, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but then the actual emotions that are associated with that state of arousal, that's another layer of processing that, that is in fact susceptible to reframing, right? That's sort of a classic sports psychology type of thing, is that you can turn that sense of anxiety and arousal into a negative state where you're like, oh God, like I don't feel ready. I don't feel good. My heart rate's already super high. I'm really worried that I'm not going to be able to keep my heart rate down when I'm doing this workout. And I can't even keep my heart rate down when it hasn't even started yet. Like I feel nauseous already. Like what's going, like that sort of spinning monkey mind thought process isn't necessarily helpful for performance. But in reality, you have this arousal state that you're going to feel no matter what. And if you reframe that then as like, this is my body getting ready to do a difficult task for which I'm prepared. I'm prepared to do the task. I'm prepared to deal with the discomfort of doing the task. I'm prepared to deal with things going wrong. I'm prepared to adjust my pace if I need to. I've done this type of thing over and over and over again, and this is my typical response before this type of thing. It hasn't stopped me in the past from having a good performance. That all those types of thoughts can then change the way that you're actually reacting to that feeling of heightened arousal. So I don't know if that's what you were saying or what you were getting at, but that would be my interpretation of that.
No, yeah, and I that's what I was kind of alluding to. And so I think thinking about people like elite athletes, right? So when you watch them perform, you see a lot of their numbers and like what their capacity is. And there's obviously going to be differences among athletes at that level, but to a certain extent, they're all relatively fit. I mean, like obviously very fit, but I mean, relative to each other, there isn't going to be like, and I'm not going to be specific to like Matt Fraser or Rich Froning or anybody like that, but I don't think in the top, like the 0.0001%, there's these massive differences in their ability to perform. There's always going to be outliers depending on the piece. Like there's always going to be specialists, but I think for the most part, do you think what separates good performance or the best performances consistently is their ability to make good predictions relative to what's about to happen? Or is it literally more of a physiological limitation at that point? Because their predictions are all relatively good relative to what they're experiencing, either because they've been doing it for so long, or they just have the ability to really understand what's actually happening. Does that kind of make sense? Like, do you think it's more of an issue of bad performance at that point, or bad performance is more of an issue of a lack of good prediction, or like physiologically they're relatively in tune with what's happening, that it's more of a true, this is physically the limitation that's occurring in the body. I like made a mistake and I can no longer produce this output because I made this mistake.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a really good question. I don't think anyone truly knows the answer to that, right? So I'll just sort of speculate wildly, and we can go from there. I mean, I do actually think that there are pretty significant physical differences in the very best of the best CrossFit athletes in terms of their ability to do a lot of stuff, right? I think that there are significant differences in terms of their ability to metabolize lactate and use it as a fuel. I think there's significant differences in their ability to continue to maintain blood flow throughout the body and not develop localized occlusions. I think there's significant differences in their ability to resynthesize creatine phosphate and continue to do relatively high power output types of things. And what I do think can happen if we're talking like purely on this physical level is that if you have enough of those things that are within a certain range, you can get these really big jumps in performance, right? Where even if some of those things are pretty close to other athletes, if you don't have the same limiting factors and you have enough of those pieces that are far enough along, you can get these huge gaps, right? I mean, you did mention Fraser, and I think Toomey similarly, right? That you can see how much better they are than everyone else, like on their actual performance. I don't think that's just, oh yeah, they're better at this kind of predictive processing piece. I think that that's an important part of it. But I think that, the combination of like, here's these 15 actual physical things that start to limit performance for athletes. And if you have 14 of them pretty good and one of them not as good, that the difference in performance between all 15 of them being way better than everyone else compared to 13 of them being way better than everyone else, like it's huge. So I don't want to discount the role of actual physical development in those performance disparities. But that said, what I do think happens in terms of this prediction type of stuff, and it's important to clarify as well that we're not just talking about this conscious prediction of how you're going to perform, right? Like, oh, I'm confident in myself and I know that I can potentially win this event, or I'm pretty confident in my pacing for how often I'm going to attempt to do a squat clean at 300 pounds in this difficult barbell battery based workout. That conscious prediction does matter. And that's a huge part of coaching athletes, is getting them to understand what's reasonable for them and how to approach workouts in a way that they have a good chance of success, and how to kind of deal with a lot of that negative self-talk and chatter that does pop up for athletes, right? That's really important. But I think equally as important, if not more important, is this subconscious ability to regulate the systems and not have these massive spikes in fatigue, right? Because I think that for a lot of folks who are, let's call them also rans at different levels, where it's like you're just shy of being able to potentially qualify for, what are we calling them now? They're not regionals, continentals. I think someone called them that, right? Which is funny. Give me a continental breakfast at the Best Western. Right. If you're an also ran there, or if you're an also ran for actually making it to the CrossFit Games, if you're an also ran at the CrossFit Games, where it's like, yeah, you're in the first heat every single time, that you see these pretty significant disparities between those people in terms of their ability to just like not blow up on workouts. And I think this phenomenon of blowing up, you mentioned the Moxie unit. You can see that happen to people. You can actually strap the Moxie unit to them and be like, your low back is totally pumped and completely desaturated. You are no longer going to be able to deadlift, right? That does happen. But what can also happen is not necessarily that specific limiter like that, but these massive prediction errors, which cause this huge spike in RPE, kind of like we talked about earlier, where if your system is like, okay, this is going to be roughly this hard, the heart rate is going to need to be roughly this much, we need to prepare roughly this much acid buffer, we need to be prepared to shuttle blood between the lower body and the upper body at roughly this frequency, like all of those things, sort of like we said before, if that's off too much, then it gets really, really hard very suddenly. And I think a lot of people have experienced that in CrossFit workouts, right? That you do just a little bit too many reps on a set of handstand push-ups, that you're doing sulpike intervals and you're like, cool, I have 10 of these intervals and they feel pretty good, but kind of challenging. And then all of a sudden your legs just completely power down. You like can't do it anymore. And what I think is happening there is this very significant prediction error on a subconscious level, right? Yeah, yes, there's the abstract, or not abstract, but conscious level of prediction where you're like, oh, I literally tried to go too fast in terms of RPM. But the subconscious thing that's happening is that your system is like, we can't tell what's going to happen. We're too far outside of the bounds of acceptable errors, and we need to shut this down. So the RPE on this next set is going to go from 7.5 to 10 basically immediately. And you don't always have a good handle on where that red line is. And I think that a big part of the difference between elite athletes and sub-elite athletes at every single level is the ability to predict appropriately so that cliff is further away, that it's really, really hard for them to fall off that cliff because they don't make as big of mistakes on either a conscious or a subconscious level, right? Their subconscious systems still make mistakes and still have to correct, but they can recover from them. They don't make a catastrophic number of mistakes that then result in full system shutdown. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way that I would look at it from like a speculative hand-wavy view.
Okay, so what I understand is the RPE increases your motivation and your ability to kind of push through that relative increase in RPE is going to decrease. So,
well, I think the motivation is separate, right? Okay. I think that the I'd have to go back and review some of Marcora's stuff, and he may not agree with this, but my interpretation of it is that the RPE is a roll up of all the stuff that's happening within the body in terms of how difficult it feels to continue to do whatever exercise you're doing. And the motivation is more like your internal state about how hard you want to try to push through that RPE, right? That even if you, but there's cutoffs, right? Even if you're highly motivated, if your RPE is actually 10 out of 10, this is the hardest thing that you have ever done, no matter what. If your motivation is higher, you will be able to push through that more than if your motivation is lower. But if your RPE is 10 out of 10 and your motivation is as high as possible, your performance will still be worse than if your RPE is 8 and your motivation is relatively low, right? That the RPE is more determinant of performance than the motivation level. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my interpretation of it.
Okay, that makes sense. And so we have these subconscious sort of self-regulating processes that are occurring that are, from what I understand, are going to dictate our performance, right? And that's relative to the amount of error in prediction. So how would you potentially improve that kind of like subconscious relationship with what's actually happening to kind of like manage that? Like, is that like kind of like managing allostatic load? And I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm understanding from that.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of good training principles do this by default, right? They, like we said at the beginning of this, maybe it's useful for coaches to understand some of these concepts, but you don't need to write good training for people or to be an effective coach, right? We see coaches all the time who say a lot of stuff that is really off base and not super accurate as far as what's going on either on a physical level with different energy systems or on like a psychological level with various magical thinking beliefs and all those kinds of things where it's like, okay, that's wrong, but you're still getting really, really good results for people because I think that the actual training behaviors that result in better predictive processing and more accurate predictions and a better ability to kind of keep everything within the appropriate error bars are just what people know of as good training, right? This idea of like, okay, you need to put yourself in positions that are somewhat uncomfortable and be able to learn how to pace yourself appropriately, how to touch those difficult levels of effort, how to go past your threshold, pull back, recover, do it again. That stuff touches a lot of things all at once that we want to improve, right? From a just a pure physical systems standpoint, it's like, okay, you're going outside of the stress zone needed to cause that system to start to improve its ability to handle that level of stress. It's like, yeah, cool. You're going to try to lift this much weight. Like, awesome. We'll figure out a way to potentially give you some more muscle fibers. We'll figure out a way to give you more ability to recruit those muscle fibers. fibers. We'll figure out a way to callus the bones such that you can even put that much weight on your back, right? That the physical systems adapt to going outside of that bandwidth and recover and then do it again. And similarly, if we can get these predictive systems to be pushed where it's like, yo, things are going wrong and we need to be able to make better predictions by simply being in that area, those predictive processes will improve such that they make fewer errors next time and don't result in that massive spiking of error rates, which causes the RPE to get cranked up to 10. Right. So that's the way that I would look at that. That's not super practical, but that's what I think is going on.
Okay. So would that be something more just like with more exposure and more experience in certain environments, your ability to self-regulate or the self-efficacy in your ability to maintain allostatic control will improve. So it's like the more you go over to the stove that is no longer on and realize that it's no longer on, you start to see that like, okay, if the knob is turned slightly to the left, the stove is on and that's what's going to cause me pain. So you make the prediction that you're not going to go over there, touch the thing. The knob is turned to the right where it says off, you know that it's not hot and you're going to go over there and you're going to touch it. The more exposure you have to that, the better you're able to essentially prepare for that specific scenario. And just kind of like you build a better relationship with that experience, and in turn you build better predictions, and your ability to maintain or return back to homeostasis will improve through that experience or that repetitive experience.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's a great way to look at it. And I think that it's important to clarify that that's happening on both a conscious and a subconscious level, right? So maybe we can try to use a more specific example to make this more salient for folks. So we can use something with burpees as an example, right? So maybe we have a few different workout scenarios. And I think anyone who's trained enough or coached enough athletes certainly has an understanding that the burpee can have totally different effects in a lot of different types of workouts, and that the pace that you should be going on burpees is going to vary wildly depending on what you're actually doing, right? So let's use an example of just kind of like a relatively high power output, somewhat short kind of grunt work conditioning piece, right? And it's relatively small sets. Let's say you're doing a 10-minute AMRAP of 10 row calories, 10 burpees, 10 wall balls, right? Like just pretty much keep cycling through that stuff. You can probably go relatively fast in terms of your cycle time. And so the pace that you're going to be going on burpees on that workout is going to be totally different than the pace that you should be going if you're doing something that's like, let's call it large sets of double unders. So like 50 double unders, 15 bar facing burpees, and then escalating weights in squat cleans, right? And the squat clean starts at a kind of moderate weight and then builds to something very, very heavy. And on that, your burpee pace is probably going to be a lot slower than your burpee pace on just row burpee wall ball, because you know that the most important thing on that squat clean workout is to be able to continue to do the squat cleans. And if you go too fast on burpees, you will not be able to do your squat clean reps. So if we think about training, we can, to use your analogy of the stove and building a better model, right? On a conscious level, in training all those different scenarios at your threshold of like, okay, we're going to try to do this. We're going to do it in different scenarios. We're going to go fast. We're going to do intervals, all this stuff. You're building a better conscious model of how you should approach your burpees of like, cool, in this scenario, I can probably go at a pace of like, nearly 20 burpees per minute. And that's going to be okay. It's uncomfortable, but that's okay. Whereas in this scenario where I have heavy weights, and especially with the bar facing burpee, if I try to like fly through those things, that's going to cause a problem for me. So your conscious model of how to approach the burpee improves simultaneously by repeatedly exposing yourself to those different scenarios in a lot of different ways. Like I said before, through intervals, through paced work, through heavy weights, through light weights, etc. Your subconscious ability to allostatically regulate all of the systems that control your physical performance is improving as well. So this isn't stuff that you're actually thinking about, but again, we're talking about stuff like the ability to quickly shuttle blood to different parts of the body, right? The ability to, recruit different muscle fibers to actually get through a heavy squat clean after doing a bunch of burpees. The ability to even create the neural drive necessary to lift a heavy load under certain amounts of fatigue, the ability to metabolize lactate and how many different enzymes need to be created or shuttled to certain areas to perform that metabolism or to resynthesize creatine phosphate, that all of these subconscious pieces are also developing a model of how to react to different types of scenarios that becomes more and more nuanced and more effective. So your actual conscious pacing improves and the subconscious allostatic mechanisms improve, and the prediction of how the pacing works and the prediction of how the allostatic mechanisms improve. So the errors that are being fed back through the system about how wrong you are about what's happening are lower as well, which reduces the chance of like serious RPE spiking out of control.
Okay, so this is actually really interesting. It almost sounds like, and this kept popping up in my head as you were explaining that, it almost sounds like something like compensation, right? Is so like physiological compensation is really rooted in prediction error. So what I mean by that is, like, say you're doing something like bar facing burpees and squat cleans, right? Or like bar facing burpees. Yeah, let's use squat cleans. When you're doing the bar facing burpees, the first time you do that, you might have a relatively squat heavy position in the bottom of your burpee, meaning so like your hips end up lower when you're coming up from the burpees and bringing your feet back to the bar, right? So it kind of just looks like you're catching more in an active lower body position. So you're stressing the lower body a little bit more, right? So you're using kind of this like leg lower body based movement pattern for your burpee. I don't know if that makes sense, but then you go and you do squat cleans, and you realize like, okay, I did my burpees a little bit quick, but also I'm using my legs a lot, right? And I'm starting to fatigue my legs. So what I'm going to do on this next set is, in an effort to potentially reduce some of the fatigue that's going to be like the physiological fatigue that's occurring in the lower body, I'm going to end up with my hips a little bit higher, put a little bit more effort into each one of my presses, try to keep my legs as extended as possible to limit active contraction of the quadriceps by keeping the knees extended, right? If I do that, I'm potentially going to conserve some of the energy in my lower body for my squat cleans, right? Or if you're doing something where you have two entirely different movement patterns like skiing and bike erg, right? So when you're on the bike erg, in an effort to shuttle as much blood to the lower body as possible, you're going to potentially occlude or vasoconstrict other areas of blood flow. Like you're going to restrict blood flow to the biceps and the shoulders and the lats, right? Because it's like, well, why do you need blood over there if your task right now is to bike, right? So then you get off the bike and the effort on the bike was high enough where the amount of blood required did result in vasoconstriction or restriction of blood flow to other parts of the body in an effort to prioritize that specific movement pattern. So then when you go to ski, your body is not prioritizing that specific movement pattern. So it has to kind of make an adjustment or compensation for an error in prediction and kind of like vasodilate the upper body quite a bit and start to pull some of the blood from the lower body, right? To prioritize like that specific movement pattern. And so then in turn, you realize that next time you get on the bike, because you learned from that prior experience, that you need to be able to not shuttle as much blood and shut off other specific movement pattern mechanisms, that you end up just going at a lighter pace so that you're able to prioritize blood flow to the upper body better after getting off the bike because you have another task required to complete. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. And again, I think it's important to note that you're learning that on both a conscious and a subconscious level, right? That you are consciously learning, oh, interesting, I have this problem when I pair a lower body cyclical movement with an upper body cyclical movement. And I need to be aware of that when selecting which pace I'm going to go. So that's the conscious learning. And then the subconscious learning is the systems that actually engage in vasoconstriction and blood flow manipulation. That those systems are also learning like, oh, interesting. We really started to struggle to generate enough muscle contraction to maintain a certain pace. So maybe we need to actually change the amount of vasoconstriction that we are doing in different areas to adjust that. And simultaneously, we need to have better predictions about what kinds of problems we're going to have with blood flow to actually feed back to the brain. Because before we were like, no, we're good. This is what we're going to do with the blood. It's going to be fantastic. And then when the brain is like, I can't contract my legs, there's not enough blood, we need to change this, that's a prediction error. And the magnitude of that prediction error in and of itself is a problem for the entire system. So you're learning on all of these different levels in that scenario.
Okay. Interesting. It almost sounds like to improve like that specifically, you almost have to avoid. It almost sounds like just like pacing practice, right?
Yeah,
like
totally.
you if you're always going super hard in every one of your pieces in training, you're limiting your body's ability to learn to prioritize all of the various different allostatic mechanisms that are happening, because like you've alluded to, there's thousands and thousands of physiological processes that are occurring to help maintain homeostasis, right? And your body's always going to prioritize the one that's probably going to have the most profound impact. And if it's doing so like say you're going extra hard on your, I don't know, burpees in the workout, it's going to prioritize recovery from that, and it's going to limit your improvement on other aspects of your performance. So it does kind of just sound like backing off a little bit and like learning to teach your almost, and so you can actually subconsciously learn to self-regulate, but you can consciously put yourself in a position where you are giving your body the subconscious ability to better self-regulate in a variety of different scenarios.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. That's sort of like a difficult sentence and a difficult thing to communicate appropriately, but your conscious strategy for a workout, the goal of that conscious strategy is to put your subconscious systems in the best position possible to self-regulate. That I think that's very insightful. And to your point just about pacing work, yeah, I mean, that's again, a lot of good training sort of touches on this stuff by default, because you're spending a lot of time kind of moving up to a threshold where stuff starts to fall apart, then recovering, then moving up to that threshold again, then recovering, then moving up to that threshold again in a different scenario and recovering. And whether that's doing intervals or kind of like playing with the different loads that you're utilizing in strength training, or doing, kind of like lactate dynamics or fartlek training, where you're sort of like going fast and rolling back off, but never actually stopping. Like all of that stuff is basically just putting you in these scenarios to improve the allostatic regulation of things being knocked out of their appropriate position, and to improve the subconscious system's ability to predict what type of allostatic regulation is going to need to be utilized. And yeah, it's like, cool, that's good training, sort of no matter how you slice it. Okay.
And so
and actually, hold on, one thing I do want to mention, because I think it's important to also note, and this is something that, we've talked about on other episodes of the Legion podcast, is that if you only do interval work, you're only doing, okay, cool, I'm going to do these escalating row paces into heavy squat cleans, and I'm going to do burpees at this exact cadence into double unders or whatever, right? That is good training. But if you only do that, then you don't have the predictive models necessary to do stuff where you're actually going as hard as possible to get the best score possible. So good training balances this constant touching of the threshold and pulling back off with also putting you in game day scenarios of like, you have to go as hard as possible. Everything is going to fall apart. Can you do those like gutted out, nasty toes to bar to get the best score that you need to get on this open workout? You also have to train the predictive mechanisms to handle that situation.
Okay. How much of that like performance is related to like pain? So and so in terms of RPE, right? So is improving your allostatic self-regulation ability improving your ability to manage pain or discomfort, or is it purely from like a physiological perspective of, I don't have blood flow here, I need blood flow here, I need to better improve like my ability to push blood flow here? Does that kind of make sense?
Well, yeah, maybe. So let me ask you this: by pain, do you mean like exercise associated discomfort?
Yeah, like acute exertion.
Okay, yeah. So not like my knee literally hurts because I have a torn ACL, but
no, not mechanical. Not something, not like structural or mechanical pain. And like literally like self-induced acute exertion results in discomfort.
Yeah. So I think that I'm not sure if this actually answers your question, but RPE is very different from pain, right? That pain can be an input into RPE, and that's actually applicable to both like mechanical pain of like injury, as well as the kind of just discomfort associated with high intensity exercise. But that both of those are inputs into RPE, because you can have people with, if you sort of make like a 2x2 of, let's just call it pain, like to kind of, roll up all these different things into one concept. And then RPE, you can have each of those states. You can have high pain, high RPE. You can have high pain, low RPE. You can have low pain, low RPE. And you can have, I don't even remember what order I said things in, low RPE, high pain. I don't remember if I said that, but I think you understand what I'm saying, that each of those states is in fact possible. Right. I do think that there probably is a point where pain is high enough that automatically forces RPE up, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I think, and I actually really like that, because I think as you start to get better at the sport of CrossFit, that sensation of pain, right, from like specific, like short bouts of acute exertion, so like exercise, right? So that feeling of pain has less of an impact on RPE than when you initially start.
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
Totally. Yeah. And I think I've used this example before, but I think hook grip is a useful scenario to think about with that, right? That if you haven't done hook grip before, it feels insane and super painful. And then you just quickly get used to it, and it may still register as not totally comfortable, but it doesn't register as pain in the same way. And for anyone who has been training for a while and using hook grip, if you take 7 to 10 days off and come back to the gym, first time you use hook grip, it's excruciating again, right? You're like, I literally can't do this. Like, I cannot do another rep. I feel like my thumbnail is going to tear off. This is so painful. But after you train again for 2 or 3 days, that processing of that nociceptive signal as pain that needs to be addressed is dialed down, and it no longer registers as pain in the same way. And so I think you get a similar phenomenon with that kind of like exercise, let's just call it like exertion-based discomfort, right? That you still are experiencing some of those signals. It's still painful, but on both a conscious and a subconscious level, that processing of those signals of discomfort is dialed down. It's not as big of a deal.
Interesting. I think last time we spoke about like soreness, and you talked about how soreness and the ability to kind of like deal or improve on soreness is like you develop these calluses. Like, so it's like when on your hands, right, you rip, you develop just like more skin tissue, like thicker skin, and so you don't rip in the future, right? It's like when your brain is in hook grip, like you have this task-oriented goal, like I need to snatch this weight, I need to potentially limit the amount of attention I'm paying to the nociceptors on my thumb, right? So that doesn't become as much of a limiting factor. I'm able to focus on other and prioritize other aspects of this performance so that I can snatch this weight. And it sounds like that's happening in a variety of different ways when you're improving your relationship with the experience that is happening when you work out. And I feel like as you begin to improve that relationship, your body's ability to simply be in a state that's able to improve its ability to self-regulate is going to improve.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that you make both physical adaptations to these types of scenarios, as well as these kind of like subconscious mental adaptations, right? That, you do develop calluses on your hands, which help protect them. But the actual mechanism by which I think you predominantly improve your ability to keep doing pull-ups, even though your hands hurt, is through this subconscious regulation of how highly that specific form of nociception from the hands needs to be weighted, right? That the calluses protect you on a physical level, but really, I mean, same thing. Again, if you take 7 to 10 days off, you still have your calluses. They're not gone. But if you try to do too many muscle ups or too many pull ups or whatever, you're like, my hands are absolutely killing me. Like, I can't hang on to the bar anymore. But then again, after 2 or 3 days of doing pull up based work again, you're fine. Right? Because that subconscious mechanism is like, oh yeah, this is totally a thing that happens. It's really fine. We don't need to register this as pain. So you're both physically adapting and mentally adapting on a subconscious level.
So do more pull-ups.
Yeah, I guess so. So Sergio, that was a lot of stuff about predictive coding, about how it relates to performance. I don't know if we really gave super practical takeaways, did we? What from a practical perspective, is there anything else that we should mention that might be useful?
So I think something that I like to talk about with my athletes when it comes to improving their ability to self-regulate on a conscious level, which, like we talked about, in turn will improve their ability to self-regulate on a subconscious level, is creating a more subjective approach to their pieces in their training, and almost trying to, I don't want to say limit emotion, because I think that can oftentimes be difficult, but not let your objective emotional experience or past experience with what you're about to experience affect your performance, and learning to dissociate certain feelings of discomfort with something like RPE or even doing well in a specific piece, right? Because in training, if you always have this marker of like training went really well today, it was really hard, I don't particularly think that's beneficial. Or like this piece was really good because it like hurt and that made me better, right? Like I think oftentimes that can put you more in this state of constantly trying to hang on and survive rather than giving your body the chance to adapt. So when it comes to isolating specific movements in pieces in training, I think subjectively focusing on, okay, how can I perform this movement in the best possible way to, which like, say there's a piece with 4 different movements, like do you mind if I use an example, like echo bike, toes to bar, burpees, and wall balls, right? So
great.
Say we have a piece that's, let's just say every 10 minutes for 3 sets, 30 calorie echo, 30 toes to bar, 30 bar facing burpees, 30 wall balls, right? And it's like, if you take the approach of, I'm going to make this hurt, you're one, I think, potentially setting yourself up to be in a little bit of control of what you're going to experience with that. And I don't necessarily think that's entirely possible. I think that just gives people a sense of control. And that isn't necessarily correlated to doing well in the piece or improving on what you need to improve on, right? So in that specific piece, if we know that the athlete struggles with something like the echo bike or the assault bike or whatever, then we're going to focus primarily on their effort on that. We know there's a specific pace that they need to hit. And then in turn, they're hitting that pace. They might start to experience like some type of discomfort or some type of fatigue. But their effort on the bike is able to stay the same because they have this like sort of task-oriented specific goal with what they're doing, right? And that in turn is what's going to result in a better performance overall. And then we can actually start to isolate and learn like, well, okay, this pace was too much, this pace was too little, and we can have something tangible to improve on, and not just like that was uncomfortable, the RPE was like too high because it hurt. And so it's kind of hard to take or have some direction on how to improve your specific imbalances, your specific weaknesses when you're consistently taking that objective approach to your pieces. So I think like taking a step back, looking at like doing well or performing well is just a result of the accumulation of good movement consistently, and isolating each one of those individual movements to have a more subjective relationship with your performance, in turn will allow your body or give your body the ability to be in a situation where it's able to improve its self-regulation mechanisms more often. And it's the accumulation of those experiences that in turn is going to improve your performance as an athlete overall.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a pretty good way to try to sum everything up. And I'll try to reduce that to maybe a few sentences, right? Let's say that if you're coaching someone, or if you're an athlete trying to design your training or get through your training, what you're essentially trying to do is to create as many scenarios as possible that enable you to learn on a subconscious level and on a conscious level how to regulate your body relative to the task that it needs to perform, right? That the more scenarios that you are able to regulate yourself properly in over time, the better your performance is going to be. And then on another zoomed out level, you mentioned some emotion stuff, right? That the goal of a coach or an athlete is to also learn how to regulate their emotions and their conscious strategy relative to those performance scenarios to get the best result possible over time. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. And to just turn that then into like, okay, here's A1, here's A2, here's part B, and here's like a Metcon with some sled pushes or whatever, right? That's how that's translated into actual coaching. But that from the ideas of this predictive processing model, that's what we're actually trying to do to help folks improve their performance.
Interesting. So it almost sounds like, and to kind of like touch up on that piece, it sounds like much like in say, for example, we're trying to achieve hypertrophy in a muscle. There's this specific stress that we have to induce, which in turn is going to induce a specific hormonal anabolic response to that stress. It almost sounds like with the predictive processing model, the sort of hormonal stress or not hormonal stress, but the stress that's in turn going to induce the adaptation mechanically is frequent prediction error with the ability, exposing yourself to frequent prediction error with the ability to adapt and kind of like respond positively and better prepare yourself for those prediction errors in the future. So like more variance, more exposure in a state that allows you to adapt to that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you want to be making prediction errors regularly in training, but within a certain range. Yeah. Right, that it's like, okay, if it's too far outside of the range, right? I mean, you can use analogies of learning math or whatever, right? Where it's like, okay, cool. Say you know a certain amount of geometry, and then you start getting certain problems that require formulas that you don't know or proofs that you can't do, but it's within the range of things that you know. Then you learn that stuff. But it's like, okay, you have a certain level of high school geometry, and all of a sudden you're trying to work in differential geometry and you're getting all these crazy differential equations and everything just looks like gibberish. That's not helpful, right? That's the example you used earlier. People who just go out way too hard on everything all the time are just constantly dying in training. It's like, you're trying to do differential geometry and all you know is the Pythagorean theorem. Like you gotta build up those pieces rather than just like smashing yourself all the time. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.